The Odyssey, Scylla and Charybdis, Calypso's prisoner. The sun was still rising when we saw the straits ahead of us in the distance. We could see the wanderers away to our right, just as Circe had described them, glistening in the sun. We entered the straits, and before long the fateful cliffs of Scylla and Charybdis came into view. The two cliffs stood across from each other at the narrowest point of the straits. At first, they looked harmless enough, but closer to them, a large area of water in front of the smaller cliff appeared to be simmering. Soon, the water began steaming and churning around until a huge whirlpool formed where Charybdis sucked the water down. My men froze in terror as our ship was drawn to the edge. For the God's sake, row before it's too late, I screamed, barely in time. The ship was slowly beginning to turn before we steered clear. We had escaped from Charybdis, but only into the shadow of the larger cliff. I could see the entrance halfway up the rock, but no sound came from the cave. Perhaps the Scylla was asleep, and we would get away unscathed. Suddenly, there was a thunderous boom across the water. We turned to see a towering fountain rise up as Charybdis blew the whirlpool out. While our backs were turned and the spray from the fountain fell on our cheeks, ghastly yelping broke out in our midst. The Scylla's 6 heads, all fangs, foul breath, and matted hair, were among us and seized 6 of the crew. They wriggled helplessly in her ugly mouths as she pulled in her scaly necks. Then she devoured them alive on the ledge outside of her cave, yelping and whining hideously the entire time. There was nothing we could do, and sick in our hearts, we rode away from the cliffs. Now I was determined to sail on until we had left these straits of death far behind. I thought we would then be sure of a safe passage home. I did not realize that our greatest trial was still to come. Calypso's prisoner. We sailed out of the straits with the hideous yelping of the Scylla still ringing in our ears, and we turned our ship east toward home. We intended to skirt the southern tip of the mainland and wait for a fair wind to carry us across the Adriatic Sea. We were prepared to wait for as long as necessary. We wanted to be absolutely sure that nothing went wrong now. Sadly for us, the gods had other ideas. As soon as we swung out into the open sea, fierce easterly winds and currents drove us back toward Trinacia. We hauled in the sails, and I urged my comrades to row for their lives, but they were no match for the elements. As the afternoon wore on, their heads began to droop, and the tempo of their oar strokes slowly dropped. The elements drove us back, and still I urged my men on, in desperation now. They were exhausted. It was Eurylochus who finally spoke out for them and demanded to turn back. Reluctantly, I agreed. With a heavy heart, I ordered my crew to turn the boat around. We pulled up the sails, and now the wind swept us toward the Thrinacian coast. My men joked that once again we were sailing in the wrong direction, but I did not share their laughter. I sat apart in the stern, and I stared at our wake. It was quickly lost in the choppy water, and this, for some reason, added to my sense of impending doom. By the time we reached the island, the sun had already sunk behind the mountains, and the light was fading fast. We sailed straight into the beautiful cove, sheltered by tall cliffs. My comrades leaped into the shadows and dragged our boat onto the sand. The sound of bleating and lowing had reached us from across the water, and now in the twilight we could make out the shapes of sheep and cattle moving around on the hillside. On the ridge, their silhouettes stood out against the sky. My men began to lick their lips. It had been a long, grueling day, and they looked forward to a feast. Right away, I jumped up onto the boat that lay beside us, and I pulled up my sword to back up my words. My friends, listen to me now, and listen well. I spoke slowly, letting my gaze rest on each of the faces below me. This is the famous island of Thrinacia, which belongs to Hyperion, god of the sun. Here, his sheep and cattle graze, 7 herds of 50 cows and 7 flocks of 50 sheep. These animals are his pride and joy, and if you touch them, then your next voyage will be your last. Both Thracias and Circe have foretold it. You must swear a solemn oath to leave these beasts alone. My men had no wish to anger the gods and quickly swore the oath. Then we took cured hams and cheese, fruit and wine from our ship's shallow hold, and made a fire on the beach to ward off the night chill. We ate hungrily after the day's exertions and drank to the souls of our lost comrades. As they drank, my men began to weep, and as they wept, sweet sleep overcame them. I, however, remained dry-eyed and alert. I stared into the glowing embers of the fire and prayed for a fair wind to carry us home. My prayers went unanswered. By dawn, a violent storm had blown up, and we gazed in dismay at the turbulent sea. The wind reached gale forces, and huge waves crashed into the rocks at the entrance to our cove, throwing great sheets of spray high over the cliff tops. We would have to wait a few days at least. That much was clear. To begin with, we waited patiently enough. We had Circe's supplies to feed us and her fragrant wine to keep our spirits up. The days passed and the storm settled down. Now we waited for the wind to change, but the days slowly turned into weeks, and the strong southeasterly wind continued to blow. We watched our supplies steadily dwindle, and the worm of anxiety gnawed at our minds. A month passed, and still the southeasterly wind blew. Now our supplies were finished, and it was the worm of hunger that gnawed at our insides. We scoured the rocks for crabs and shellfish and made hooks and lines to fish in the sea. But the little we caught only teased our appetites and made our hunger worse. Then we roamed the wooded hills of Thrinacia in search of game, but there was none to be found. And all around us, Hyperion's golden cattle and snow-white sheep grazed peacefully while we starved. Even when we sat on the beach and looked out to the sea, away from the hills, the sound of lowing cattle and bleating sheep was always in our ears. My men were at the end of their line. As a last resort, I left my companions on the beach and walked up into the nearby hills, weak from hunger and lack of sleep. I struggled on until I reached the highest ridge. From the summit, I had a commanding view of the southeast coastline and back across the island to the central mountain range. It was a holy place. I knelt down and bared my soul to the gods while the sun went down over the distant mountains. Then soft sleep crept up behind me and took me unaware. When I awoke, the sun was already high in the sky. My long sleep had refreshed me, and my hunger seemed to have miraculously disappeared. On my way back down to the beach, I realized that the wind had at last changed. I thought that our trials were over. The wind was now blowing down from the hills. I only smelled the roasting flesh when I came to the beach. In spite of my warnings and in breach of their solemn promise, my men had helped themselves to Hyperion's cattle. "Noble Odysseus," said Eurylochus, who was the first to see me, "don't be dismayed. We know this is forbidden meat, but what choice did we have? We've made sufficient sacrifices to the gods and promised to build Hyperion a magnificent temple if we're allowed to return home safely." Too dismayed to be angry, I buried my face in my hands. If only I had stayed on the beach. Surely I could have persuaded my companions to wait just one more day. By now, we could have left the shores of Thrinacia far behind. Instead, my men had broken divine law and could expect no mercy. Hyperion would have his revenge. There was a sudden gasp from my companions. I looked up to see the carcasses of the slaughtered cattle writhe and shiver on the sand. At the same time, the meat that my men were already roasting on the spits began to bellow like cattle in pain. The gods had spoken, and my men were seized with terror. They begged me to leave the island at once. "Whether we stay or go makes no difference now," I replied, "but since you wish to go, then let us go." Without another word, we dragged our ship down to the water, raised the masts and sails, and rowed away from the shore. The slaughtered cattle still lay writhing on the sand, and the bellows of the roasting meat echoed around the cove as we sailed out into the open sea. Hardly had the sound faded behind us when black clouds massed overhead and a sudden tempest whipped us up the sea. Clinging to the mast, I looked up to see great Zeus himself burst out of the clouds with an arm raised high above his head. In the next moment, his arm came down and hurled his dreaded thunderbolt straight at our ship. The vessel exploded, and those men not killed by the blast were drowned. I alone survived, but it seemed that I had only been saved for a more horrible end. I had clung to the mast as the ship broke up around me, and it kept me afloat in the seething water. The storm soon abated, but our old friend, the southeasterly wind, now returned to drive me back to the wicked straits of Scylla and Charybdis. All through the night, that same wind blew, and when morning came, I saw the dreaded cliffs ahead of me. Before I knew it, I was racing toward the small cliff. I was just feet away when the water began churning. Charybdis was sucking her whirlpool in. I clung to the mast and shut my eyes. There was nothing I could do. Seconds later, the far end was sucked down with such violence that I was catapulted high up into the branches of the fig tree that grows out of the cliff.